Hello and welcome to our evening with Housmans Books. You are all filing virtually into the room, so I will blather a little bit as you all appear and manifest in the list of participants. My name is Karen Shook. I'm your chair for this evening's event, Protest and Resist. I can't tell you how delighted I am to have a lineup like this evening. Tonight, we will be speaking to writer, journalist, and academic Martyn Bedford, Professor David Waddington, and also we will have a reading of Martyn's story by Christopher Eccleston. I'd just like to start this evening. I can see the numbers going up and up and up, which means you are all jostling in. So there's something good to be said about Zoom because there are no elbows involved. So I think really the way I need to start this evening's event, and we're a little late, so thank you all for your patience, is to start with some words of thanks. First, thanks to all of you. Thanks to everyone who's joined us this evening. You know, because we're meeting by Zoom, you'll have to take my word for it. But let me just say that if we were gathered in person tonight at a Housmans, our number would have filled the shop several times over. I mean, many times over. We'd be spilling all the way down Caledonian Road. So thank you all for coming along. I also want to say thank you to Becca, Zoe, and Ra from Comma Press, who've made all this possible. They've co-organized our events tonight and tomorrow night. I'll be talking about tomorrow night's event a little later on. Comma Press, some of you may know, is a not-for-profit publisher based in Manchester and specializing in the beautiful art of the short story. In 2020, it won Small Press of the Year in the north of England at the British Book Awards. And Comma Press also works as a writer development agency, delivering short story courses and conferences to give budding writers, publishers, and translators access to advice, knowledge, and skills. And in 2016, Comma Press founded the Northern Fiction Alliance. That's a radical publishing collective showcasing the creative, diverse, and outward-looking publishers in the north of England. The reason they're involved this evening, of course, is that they are publisher of an amazing set of history into fiction anthologies. Here's where I do my home shopping channel bit and show you these two incredible books, Protest, which we're featuring tonight, and its successor, Resist. They're collections of fiction and essays that pair authors with experts and witnesses. They explore and commemorate key moments of British protest and defiance over the last 2 millennia. And of course, when I'm giving thanks, I have to thank tonight's guests, writer Martyn Bedford and Professor David Waddington, and also actor Christopher Eccleston, who will be joining us shortly. All three of these gentlemen have generously given their time and talent in our event that helps support radical, progressive, and independent publishing and book selling in a very difficult time. And finally, although Housmans' physical doors are shut, the virtual doors of our online shop remain open. Not all of our staff are working on site at the moment, so shipping your orders might take a little longer than usual. So we're so grateful to you for your patience and your understanding and your support. Ordering from Housmans or any independent bookseller really does make a difference. So thank you so much. So it's wonderful that everyone in the chat box is saying hello. Let us know where you are zooming in from. We're just so pleased. Another great thing about not being a real in-person event full of elbows and people jostling at the door is that we're extending our reach far beyond N1 and the other parts of London. So I thought I would let you know about the format for this evening. So the plan is to have Christopher Eccleston begin by reading Withen. I've had advice on the pronunciation from the author. It's a short story by Martyn Bedford that's part of this anthology, Protest, Stories of Resistance. Withen is a story about courage, about community, state violence, and its legacy. It's about divided loyalties in families, in class, and in society. It's deeply moving. And you may know that the setting is the events of Monday, the 18th of June, 1984, at Orgreave coking plant on the outskirts of Sheffield, just 7 miles from Hillsborough Stadium, and during the miners' strike of 1984 to 1985. After Christopher's reading of the story, we're going to then go on to a conversation between Martyn and Dave, who collaborated on this part of this anthology. Martyn contributed the short story, and Dave contributed a chapter that looks at the historical setting, looks at the events of Orgreave. I, as chair, I'll be sticking my oar in, hopefully not too much, but they're both gentlemen, so they won't call me a daft woman, tell me to be silent. But I hope we'll have a chance to talk about Orgreave, about truths and lies, and about what this bloody day and the miners' strike really represent. Then following that conversation, and there'll be no shortage of things to talk about there, I'm sure, is that there'll be an opportunity for you to be part of this conversation via discussion, facilitated via our Q&A session. So if you have a question to ask of Martyn or of Dave or both, or a general comment, please pop that into the Q&A box, which you can see at the bottom center of your screen. So we've probably all done the Zoom drill before. Chat, feel free to tell us where you're from. A question that you want to be brought up in the Q&A, please put it in the Q&A box. So I think we are just waiting for Christopher to join us shortly. So prior to that, if you don't mind, I might just give you a little more information about these two gentlemen that have contributed to such a memorable part of this anthology. I understand that it's a logging issue. So Christopher will be with us shortly. But in the meantime, let me say a few words of praise about these two humble gentlemen. So Martyn Bedford lives in Ilkley. He was raised in Croydon, and he spent 15 years as a news reporter, and he went on to become the author of 5 novels for adults: Acts of Revision, which won the Yorkshire Post Best First Work Award, Exit, Orange and Red, The Houdini Girl, which is a favorite of mine, Black Cat, and The Island of Lost Souls. He's also the author of 2 novels for young adults, Never Ending from 2014, and before that, Flip, which was shortlisted for the Costa Children's Book Award, the winner of the Sheffield Children's Book Award, the Calderdale Book of the Year Award, the Bay Book Award, and the Emmanuel College Book Award. So basically, he had to get a bigger shelf at home. Martyn's first collection of short stories, Letters Home, has been published by Comma Press. And Dave, I'm allowed to call him Dave. You could call him Professor Waddington if you like, but they don't stand on ceremony at Sheffield Hallam. He's a native of Castleford in West Yorkshire. He's Professor of Communications and co-director of the Cultural Communication and Computing Research Institute at Sheffield Hallam University, where he started out as a postdoctoral research associate in March 1983. And those of you who have been looking at his entry in protest along with Martyn's story will know that his early days as a researcher enter into his discussion of Orgreave. It was work that actually put him there on the day. Since being appointed, Dave has continued to publish widely on the policing of public order, clearly very relevant to tonight's discussion, industrial relations in the coal fields, and the sociology of Britain's mining communities. His latest book, Pit Folk and Peers, The Remarkable History of the People of Friston, I want to say Friston. Volume 1 has just been published by Root in Pontefract. So apologies there for Dave, you'll have to forgive me already. We haven't even got to my nosy questions yet. So as you can see, tonight's event is going to be really insightful. And I think maybe I should tell you a little bit about Christopher Eccleston, in case his work is not known to anyone here this evening. I can give you a few pointers. Christopher Eccleston is a British actor with a career in television, film, and theatre that spans 30 years. His early television work included roles in Cracker, in Hillsborough, and Our Friends in the North, for which he received a BAFTA TV Award nomination. He was also nominated in this category for his leading performance in The Second Coming, And in 2011, he won the Emmy for Best Performance by an Actor for his role in the TV crime drama Accused. He's also starred in popular dramas The Leftovers, The A Word, and Come Home. Christopher is just manifesting on screen, so I'll finish praising him and then I'll put him to work.
Praise away, praise away.
His film career was launched in 1991's a critically acclaimed film, Let Him Have It. And in 1994, he collaborated with the Academy Award-winning director and general brilliant man, Danny Boyle, on Boyle's first feature film, Shallow Grave, which was closely followed by Jude. Christopher's got a few stage credits to his name as well, I think you may know, including A Doll's House at Donmar Warehouse, Hamlet, from an up-and-coming young playwright at the West Yorkshire Playhouse, Miss Julie at the Haymarket Theatre, and Aide Memoire at Royal Court Theatre. And most recently, he played the title role in the RSC's production of Macbeth. Christopher, you've been given your marching orders. You've been given a brilliant piece of fiction to read. We've warmed up the audience. They've promised to behave. And all I can say again is thank you so much for joining us. And we'd love to hear your reading of Martyn Bedford's story, Withen. Thank you.
Sorry about the technical difficulties. Hello, Martin. Hello, David. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Withen by Martyn Bedford, 2014. Everyone filed out of the chapel to gather by the reeds, which were arranged in front of the stand bearing Dad's name, sharp and in the air with their scent. We stood in the September sunshine, too warm in our formal clothes. People said what a lovely service it had been. My sister-in-law, Tanya, told me how much she'd liked my speech. You did Don proud. The note cards were still in my fist, bent into a tube and damp with sweat. I thanked her, slipped the cards into the pocket of my suit jacket. Susie caught my eye through the crowd of mourners and mouthed, "You okay?" I nodded. She was with Mam, stooping to retrieve the cellophane-wrapped messages and reading them out to her, the dutiful daughter-in-law. Not that my mother would have had more than the vaguest idea who Susie was. Rich nudged me my elbow. "What the fuck's he doing here?" he said under his breath. I looked where he was looking. A figure stood at the top of the steps that climbed a grass embankment above the chapel. The thick brows, the great dome of his head, Uncle Peter. 30 years older than the last time I'd set eyes on him, but unmistakable. It should have fallen to me to take charge of the situation. But ever since the two of us were big enough to fight, the age difference between me and Rich had seemed notional. I was the kid brother. I just happened to have been born first. That's how it had been when I was a boy. I felt no different now, age 53. We just pretend we haven't seen him, Rich said, as if I'd suggested exactly that. Tanya must have cottoned on that something was wrong. "Who is it?" "Dad's brother," I told her. She hadn't met Uncle Peter, but it was clear she knew all about him. She laid her hand on my brother's sleeve. "Don't make a scene, Rich. Not today, not here." Richard freed his arm and, before we could stop him, made his way over to the steps. 1984. When the footage came on, Chinese subtitles scrolling down one side of the screen, I didn't realise what I was watching at first. Becca sat beside me on the bed. We were drinking beer and swapping stories from our day, half an eye on the news. The TV was parked on a chest of drawers across the room in an 8th floor bedsit of a 17-storey block in Sim Sha Si, huddled among the high rises of Kowloon. The violence played out through a fuzz of interference. Missiles arcing down on the police lines. Close-up of a cop, blood staining his blood, his blonde sideburn bright red. Long-haired guy in a t-shirt and jeans, aiming a kung fu kick. Police in riot gear, scattering people across a scrubby, dusty field. Mounted cops in formation, riding, cantering, right at the men as they fled. It was only when I heard Orgreave that I finally caught on. I gestured at the TV with my beer bottle. Fucking hell, that's just a few miles from where my folks live. We'd arrived in Hong Kong 4 weeks earlier. You could pick up work as an English tutor. No qualifications required or teaching experience. They just wanted native English speakers for one-to-one conversation. By the day of Orgreave, I'd been traveling for 9 months. The US, Canada, Australia, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia. I celebrated my 23rd birthday in the March in a bar in Singapore with a few others from the backpackers hostel. That week in the UK, the miners' strike had started. Your dad's out, Mam announced when I phoned so that she could wish me a happy birthday. Rich as well, and Uncle Peter. I'd read about Corton Wood and the other pits in the Straits Times, so I wasn't surprised the walkouts had spread to Withen, Maine. It was more than that, though. Arthur's called out the whole country, Mam said. She always referred to Scargill by his first name, as if he was a friend of the family. Should I come home? What good would that do, love? That remark still niggled me later in the bar. I drank too much, too quickly, and wound up in an argument with the only other Brit, Branwell, 20, on a gap year. The miners are already paid heaps, aren't they? They're not striking for more money. Why then? What other reason could there be? His expression said. To save the pits from closing, to save their jobs, their families. Well, how does that work? Bramwell laughed through his nose. They close a pit by going on strike to stop the pit from closing. Genius. If the government shuts a mine, I said, it might as well shut down the whole community. But you wouldn't know about that, would you, living in Hampshire? He studied me through the cigarette smoke. I mean, who'd even want to work down a mine anyway? My dad, my brother, my uncle, most of the lads I were at school with, were. I hadn't said were instead of was in about 5 years. Not you, though. And remind me, Matt, where is it you live now? I took a slug of beer to stop myself from calling him a Tory wanker right there in front of everyone. We'd become a spectator sport, me and Bramwell. The table jolted, spilling someone's drink, as I stood up and headed for the toilets. Bramwell hit one nail on the head. I'd been backpacking since September, but I'd been away for years. Since going to journalism college in Harlow, there was an identical course at Sheffield, a bus ride from Withen, but I wanted to be near London to pick up shifts on the Nationals. That's why, when I graduated, I took a job on the South London Press instead of applying to the papers back home. Dad had asked if I was trying to tell them something. It was his way of letting me know I would be missed, while also reminding me where I was from. Rich had put it more bluntly. Matt's too clever for Withen, Dad. 3 and a bit years I worked at the SLP, sharing a rented house in Gypsy Hill with a vegan motorcycle courier who said, "Hey up, lad," every time I entered a room. After I'd finished skulking in the toilets, I went to buy another drink, delaying the moment when I'd have to rejoin the others. You're very cute when you're angry. It was one of the Kiwis, standing beside me at the counter. She'd only arrived at the hostel that morning, blonde, freckly, pretty. She looked like she enjoyed making mischief. "Sorry about that," I said. "About what?" Sour in the mood, poop in the party. It's your party, birthday boy. And I'll cry if I want to. Besides, the guy's a total dick. She pronounced it duck. I laughed. Sade was playing. Shady, Mam called her, not Sade. What's that? I asked, pointing to what looked like a dried out chili on a cord round the Kiwi girl's throat. It's a Maori aphrodisiac charm, makes me irresistible to men. Does it work? She laughed and gave me a thump on the arm. Can I get you a drink? I asked. At last, he gets the whole point of the conversation. I'm Becca, by the way. We travelled together after that night. Malaysia, Thailand, Burma. Now, there we were in Kowloon, watching Orgreave. Is that the pit where you lot work? No, an Orgreave's not a pit. It's a coking plant, I explained. It's a coking plant. I explained about turning coal into coke for use in steel making. The miners are trying to blockade it. Would any of your folks have been there today? On the TV, a car had been set alight. Rich, maybe, I said. Not Dad or Uncle Peter, I wouldn't have thought. They're a bit old for scrapping with the plods. The footage ended. The bulletin cut to the studio and a number 3 typhoon warning. 2014. Once they'd finished talking, Uncle Peter turned away and walked stiffly along the path that led to the car park. My brother rejoined us, tugging his tie loose. Said he'd come to pay his respects. Rich ran a hand over the lower half of his face, as if checking whether he needed a shave. In fact, his skin was perfectly smooth, still pink in places with razor burn. I told him we were about 30 years too fucking late for that. I glanced back up the path, but Uncle Peter was already lost from view. My brother and his wife joined Mam in the funeral car, along with their kids. It eased away so quietly, you wouldn't have known the engine was running. I told Susie about Rich confronting Uncle Peter. If she had an opinion about that, she kept it to herself. Laura and Ben stood with us, both on their phones, messaging. We headed away from the chapel along the wooded path, the last of the mourners. This year's leaves had yet to fall, but last autumn still lay on the ground in places, dry as paper underfoot. Thanks for looking after Mam back there, I said. She kept asking where your dad was. What did you say? That Don had probably snuck off somewhere for a smoke. When I didn't respond, Susie added, I didn't know what to say for the best. I mean, no. I'd have most likely said the same. Anyway, he would have, wouldn't he? If Dad were here, he'd been having a crafty fag. I checked that Laura and Ben weren't lagging too far behind. Remember the first time you came home? He was so stressed at meeting you, he got through about 30 woodbines that afternoon. I've never known him pronounce so many H's. They kept calling you Matthew. Did they? I'd forgotten that. Actually, Susie said, I think they were as nervous of you as they were of me, in case they let you down in front of your new London girlfriend. That evening, we'd gone down to the Wellfire with Mam and Dad for a drink and to introduce Susie to my brother and Tanya, who was his fiancée then. Rich had just finished the shift and was telling us about a runaway tub which had nearly wiped someone out. The work must be so dangerous, Susie said. I can't imagine how you guys do it. There was a pause. I saw Rich and Dad exchange glances. They could decide to feel patronised by this poshly spoken southerner, or they could let it go. I cut in. Tell Susie about your accident, Dad. Dad looked at me. He saw right away what I was doing. He wasn't one for talking all that much since he developed his stammer, but he told her the story. Told it the way he always used to, for people hearing it for the first time, punctuated with sips from his pint. This were a few years ago, he began. I were cutting with my mate, Ralph, when there were this almighty great crack. Didn't have time to dive out of the way or out. Buried up to me chest like. It were right quiet at first and my lamp had gone out, so it was pitch black. Then I heard Danny Rudge go, "No, Ralph, Don's gone." Well, I thought they were just going to leave me there. So I managed to get my hands for free. There were these two wooden props holding most of the weight off me. And I'm banging about and shouting, "I'm all right, I'm all right." And then Ralph and Danny come scrambling over this great slurry heap and started pulling me out. "Were you hurt?" Susie asked. She'd been hanging on every word. "Me legs were stuck, see?" He fell quiet, staring at his beer. "Tell her, Dad," Rich said. I loved him for saying that, for playing along. Dad shook his head, blinked away the moistness in his eyes. "You tell her, son." Rich pointed at Dad's legs. "He lost them both," he told Susie. Silence around the table. "My God, I had no idea," Susie said, her own eyes welling up. "You lost both your legs?" she asked Dad. After a moment, he said, Not me legs, no, me boots." "Your boots?" "Aye, brand new they were. I paid a flaming fortune for them boots." We all fell about laughing. When Susie called us a bunch of bastards, we laughed harder still, and she was laughing loudest of all. We emerged from the shade of the trees into the car park, bright as an overexposed photograph. Susie aimed the fob at our VW and popped the locks. It was only as I shrugged off my suit jacket and opened the front passenger door that I spotted him, sitting on a bench in the small water garden below the parking area. From the back, it might have been my dad. A plume of cigarette smoke feathered in the air above his bald head. I remembered my uncle as broad, stocky, barrel-chested, like one of the wrestlers on World of Sport, Mick McManus, although Rich reckoned he looked more like the baddie in Thunderbirds. We used to pretend to hypnotise each other behind his back whenever he, Aunt Sylvia and our cousins came round. Sitting there, smoking, he appeared stooped and round-shouldered, shrunken. 1984. On the way back from the International Telephone Exchange, I spotted one of the Coal Not Dole stickers on the subway. Rich had sent several sheets of them, and Becca and I stuck them wherever we could. I've no idea what the local people made of them. The few of my students who knew of the strike were bemused by what they'd seen on TV. "Why police not have water guns?" one asked me, Leon. All of our students chose anglicised names for themselves, in addition to their Chinese ones: Cindy, Peggy, Irene, Flora, Charles, Marvin, Mercedes in one case. "Cannon," I corrected Liam. "Water cannon." "Yes, water cans and crying gas and rubber bullet. Why England police not have?" He sounded puzzled, but also indignant, as if some natural law had been breached. Kowloon side, Becca was waiting for me in the cafe in the basement of our building, sitting at one of the formica top tables, a fat teapot and 2 small cups set out. Steam rose off her tea. When she saw me, she smiled and began pouring mine. The place was full. We were the only non-Chinese. "I've ordered congee," she said as I sat down opposite her. "That okay?" I would have preferred toast and eggs, but I said, "Yeah, that's good." Billy Joel was playing on the radio, Uptown Girl. The Hong Kong stations had run a continuous loop of his songs since we'd arrived, when they weren't playing Two Tribes. "How's things at home?" Her tone was bright. It was just a regular phone call, the weekly check-in with my folks, so she had no reason to suppose anything was wrong. Then, as she set the teapot back down, she must have taken a proper look at my face. "Matt?" I was so tremulous, I couldn't believe the cups didn't rattle as I placed my palms on the table. The sour fumes from the tea made my eyes water. "Dad's in hospital." "Your dad?" "No." Her chin puckered. "What? I mean, how is he? Is he okay?" "Yeah, the hospitals are full of people who are okay." I don't know where that came from, or what she'd done to deserve it. I waved a hand as if to erase the words, "Sorry." The waitress appeared. She was about 10 years old in blue dungarees and wearing a Beatles haircut. She set down the bowls and plates, thick rice and fish porridge, and tubes of spongy bread. In our first week in Hong Kong, after months of Southeast Asian food, we ate McDonald's every day. More recently, we've been conditioning ourselves for mainland China. The girl told us to enjoy, looking delighted to have spoken this one word of English. After she'd gone, I said, "There was a swelling on the brain, but it's come down." I couldn't meet Becca's gaze. "Man thinks he might be out by the weekend." I drew 2 pairs of chopsticks from the dispenser and handed one to her, still in its paper sheath. It was noisy in the cafe. Clatter, conversation, music. "What happened?" she asked. "He went to Orgreave with Rich, my uncle as well." I popped my chopsticks from their wrapper. "Dad got separated from the other 2. I took a breath. "Apparently the cop hit him 3 times. 1 to knock him down, then 2 more whacks while he was on the ground. 2 that Dad can't remember anyway." "Jesus." "They're going to charge him." "Good, too bloody right." "Not the cop, my dad." "No." "They're just waiting for the doctor to say he's well enough to be questioned." "Charge him with what?" "With whatever they like. Just being there is enough." As we picked at the food, I recounted what Mum had said, how things had become too leery for Dad's liking on the field, and how he and Uncle Peter had retreated to the village, out of harm's way. How the rest of the pickets were eventually forced back there too, across the railway line or over the bridge, and how the police had gone after them, hunting them down. Dad was in wrong place at wrong time, as Mum put it. I couldn't understand what he was doing at Orgreave in the first place. Rich was the flying picket. He went wherever he was needed, down to Nottinghamshire, if he could sneak past the roadblocks. Dad stuck closer to home at Withen, Maine, standing outside the pit where he'd worked since he was 16. "It's only a token," he'd said one time when Mam passed him the phone. "It's 100% here. Other morning, a pigeon flew over gates and me and your uncle shouted, 'Scab!' for the sake of something to shout 'Scab!' at. Even the coppers laughed." Dad was a veteran of the 72 and 74 strikes. He was in his 30s back then. At 48, he no longer needed to prove himself on the lines. Picketing was just something you did. "That gets less macco with age," he pronounced it. He pronounced it macco. Rich was 21. Him and the other young lads were going for it, according to Dad. Like bloody football hooligans, some of them. I pushed the bowl away for a moment. For a moment, I thought I might be sick. I saw Becca sneak a glance at the clock on the wall. 8:40. Our first tutorials were at 9. What are you going to do? She asked. I'll go in. I can't just not turn up. I didn't mean that. The longest time came on the radio. Billy fucking Joel, I muttered. But she paid no notice. She was waiting for me to answer her question. The actual question. I'd never known Becca look at me like that, as if she didn't recognize me. I don't know, I said. Yes, you do. You just can't say it to me. 2014. Now then, I said, sitting down beside him. After 30 years, hello, Uncle Peter. After 30 years, hello, Uncle Peter would have sounded too juvenile, and calling him plain Peter didn't seem appropriate either. He must have heard me approach because he showed no sign of being startled. A brief glance, that was all, as if to check which one of us it was. Matt, he said with a slight nod. The bench faced a perfectly oval pond, fringed with ornamental grasses, encircled by a brick path and a margin of neatly laid pebbles, like a water feature in a Japanese garden. For a moment, I was put in mind of Becca, the faintest of blasts from the past. You're just about the last person I expected to see today, I said. Aye. Rich said much the same back there, only with more effing and jeffing. I can't believe my brother swore. You sure it was him? Uncle Peter let out something that might have been a laugh. Anyhow, I don't need telling twice, Matt, so I'll finish this. He raised a cigarette and be on my way. I gazed out across the valley, the sweep of pasture and woodland. There are worse spots to sit, I said. The last time we'd seen one another, he was several years younger than I am now, his face looming at the bedroom window of his darkened house. Below, in the garden, I stood with my brother. We'd already thrown 2 half bricks through the downstairs windows, but Rich insisted we stay so that our uncle saw who'd done it. I pointed to a sapling close to the pond, a plaque planted in the soil at its base, and the blue and white ribbons fluttering from the spindly trunk. Wednesday fan, do you think? Uncle Peter nodded. Well, his suffering's over now. I couldn't help smiling. He'd always been the joker of the family. I can see their ground from my house, he added. You're in Sheffield these days? Walkley Bank, aye. He paused. You still follow Leeds? Not really. I watch them when they're playing in London, that's all. He took another draw on his cigarette. Never knew how you could support that lot. Broke Dad's heart, me being Leeds. Every other Saturday, we'd stand on the Lowfields terrace, arriving an hour before kick-off, so I could bag a place at the front of the middle tier. Dad would watch the game with his little radio pressed to his ear to find out how Rotherham were getting on. The radio, one of its successors anyway, held together by 2 rubber bands, was in the bedside cabinet at the hospital when Rich and I cleared out his personal effects. When he was ill, I said, even quite near the end, he always got me to read out the football stories from the paper if I was visiting. I would feed him too, spooning yogurt into his mouth or tinned peaches cut up small for him to swallow. I shaved him, trimmed his toenails. When Dad soiled himself, I washed him and replaced his incontinence pad. I didn't tell Uncle Peter any of this. Cancer, Warwick? He asked. 2 years ago. We'd reached this point where people died, family, and we didn't know, or even know where they lived, or anything about their lives anymore. How did you hear about Dad? I still get advertisers sent over. Saw it in funeral notices. Uncle Peter had finished his cigarette. He pinched the tip between his thumb and middle finger, as Dad used to, and slipped the stub in his jacket pocket. I weren't going to come, he said, but he let the sentence trail off with a shrug. I finished it for him. He was your brother. Aye, he was. When all's said and done, we were brothers. He stood up with difficulty, one hand holding the back of the bench for support. New hip, he explained. Looking in the direction of the car park, he asked, that your missus? I stood as well. Yeah, Susie. Those are our kids in the back, Ben and Laura. Their faces were towards us, hologrammed by the sunlight on the glass. That night in the winter of 1984, our uncle hadn't come downstairs. He'd remained at the bedroom window, motionless, watching us, watching him, until Rich and I turned away, let ourselves out of his garden, and headed off down the silent street. Will you come back, I said, to the wake? I don't think that's a good idea, do you? I'm asking you. I'd like you to be there. Uncle Peter turns towards me. You don't half have a look of him, you know. I was thinking the same about you. After a moment, he said, what about Rich? The old lags from the pit? He still held on to the bench, standing at an awkward angle, as if one leg was longer than the other. A sheen of sweat had formed in the greyish stubble above his top lip. What about your mother? It's Dad's funeral, I said, not theirs. 1984. It was Saturday before I could get a flight out of Hong Kong. Sunday when I stepped off the bus at Withen. Dad had been discharged the day before. He was lying in bed with the curtains shut when Mam took me up. The light gave him headaches, she explained. The room smelled of stale sweat and the lemon barley water which stood in a jug on the bedside table. Matt's here, love. But Dad was dozing. I set the dressing table stool beside the bed and watched him sleep while Mam went downstairs to make a brew. In the gloom, the gauze patch on his head might have been a scrap of paper that had blown in through the window and landed there. Dad looked as if he'd aged about 10 years in the 10 months since I'd last seen him. He woke before Mam reappeared, rolling his head to one side and blinking at me as if he suspected I might be a figment of his imagination. Hello, Dad. What are you doing here? Nice to see you too. You should have stayed in Hong Kong. That whack on the head has made you less grumpy then. I told her you'd do this, Mam, he meant. Told her not to say out to you. Mam was in the doorway, carrying a tray of tea and biscuits. The logo on one of the mugs read, NUM, support the miners. Who's her? She said. The cat's mother? Dad pushed himself up into a sitting position while I repositioned the pillows at his back. How long have you had the ponytail? He asked. A couple of months, I said. Don't start at him, Don. He's just flown halfway around the world to see you. When Rich came in later, he gave the ponytail a flick. You Matt's girlfriend? Very funny, I said. Hey, Dad, what do you reckon? My brother half turned me towards the bed. Is it just me? Or does Matt look like the back end of a police horse? The ponytail had been Becca's idea. My hair was already collar length when I left England and had decided not to cut it the whole time I was away. You know what would really suit you? She said, trailing her fingers through my hair after the first time we'd made love. So by the time we left Singapore, I was a ponytailed man. We'd been politely awkward with each other during my last 3 days in Kowloon, as if preparing for or protecting ourselves from the other's absence. We revised our plans. I would somehow scrape together enough cash to fly out and rejoin her when Dad was fully recovered. If I couldn't, she'd travel to Europe anyway, to England. I'd been home 2 weeks when I received a blue airmail envelope. It contained a long, lovely letter which ended with Becca saying she decided to go to Japan. The editor at the South London Press agreed to rehire me as a features writer. I moved back down to London. Anything spare from my wages, I sent to Mum and Dad. The strike was 4 months old by then, and Mum was the only one bringing any money into the house. From the little she earned as a school dinner lady and the part-time cleaning job she'd taken on. They'd sold the car, Richie's drum kit and hi-fi system, the bone china crockery and walnut sideboard Mum had inherited from Gran. Most of their food came from donations to Withen Women Against Pit Closures, which their committee divvied up between the striking families. When she wasn't working or making sandwiches at the welfare or shaking a collection bucket in Rotherham for the WWAPC, Mum toured the country with some of the other women to give talks and raise funds. I'd even set up a visit to South London to address the local trades council. To see her before a room full of strangers, nerveless, articulate, informed, was a revelation. At home, the sole woman in a house of opinionated men, she was usually more of an observer than a participant whenever politics cropped up. But there she was, at Lambeth Town Hall, bringing 100 people to their feet in applause. I recorded every word for the piece we ran in the paper. Make no mistake, this dispute isn't just about coal mines or the mining industry or miners. It's about all of us, all of you. What we're witnessing is naught less than a planned attack on the British working class and our communities. Mr. Ridley, Mr. McGregor, Mrs. Thatcher, they hate us. And if we let them, they will destroy us. When the clapping finally subsided, the Prime Minister, when the clapping finally subsided, the Prime Minister didn't batter my husband at Orgreave. She didn't put him in hospital. You won't find her fingerprints on that truncheon. Mum paused. But when I look at my husband, my Don, and see what he's become since that day, Mrs. Thatcher's shadow hangs over him as surely as if she was standing right there in the room. The police didn't charge Dad in the end. They might as well have banged him up in a cell, though, because he'd more or less imprisoned himself in his own home. He spent most of his waking hours watching television, filling the living room with cigarette smoke. He no longer picketed, seldom left the house at all, except to sit in the backyard with the Daily Mirror or the Rotherham Advertiser if the weather was fine. The doctors couldn't tell if the speech impediment was physical or psychosomatic. He's lost confidence in himself, Mum said, when I was home one weekend and we were alone in the kitchen. A cupboard door bangs and he jumps like he's been shot. He looks as if he's lost weight, I said. Well, he would do. There aren't many calories in Woodbines and PG tips. I tried to piece together what happened to him at Orgreave, but Dad was reticent about it, and Rich had become separated from in the chaos and so didn't witness the incident. According to Uncle Peter, Dad was hiding behind an ice cream van when he got hit. An ice cream van? Aye, Rock on Tommy it were called. He, Aunt Sylvia and our cousins had come round for Sunday dinner because it was cheaper to use one oven than two. I'd gone on to Asda to buy some sarnies and left your dad queuing for 99s. Blimey, Rich said. You two aren't exactly like Fidel Castro and Che fucking Guevara, are you? We all laughed around the table, even Mam, despite the language, even Dad. When I headed back from supermarket, Uncle Peter went on, the streets were swarming with coppers, chasing our lads all over the place, running into folks' gardens and everywhere. You were already on ground by then, Don. This fella from Thurcroft had taken his T-shirt off and were using it to stop blood from where you'd been clobbered. Do you remember any of that, Dad? I asked. I remember paying for 99s, but I don't remember getting any change. The thing from that day that sticks in Dad's mind above all else is the vibration from the police horses' hooves as they cantered across the field. You could feel it in your feet and right up your legs. I've lost count of the times he told me that in the years since. In the film footage and photos which I've trawled through, I've only ever found one shot of my father at Orgreave. It's in a video clip of pickets rolling a tractor tyre down the slope towards the police lines. You can make out Dad, Uncle Peter and my brother in the background. Dad throws his head back, amused by something Uncle Peter says. They look happy, drenched in sunshine, shirtless in Rich's case, like three men on a works outing to the seaside. I've asked, but none of them can recall what my uncle said to make Dad laugh. 2014. You'd never known it had been there, would you? Uncle Peter said. We were in his little green Corsa, following Susie along the road that passed the industrial estate where Withen Main had once stood. The wheel from the winding gear had been installed like a piece of modern sculpture in a small park at the bottom of the high street, but otherwise, there was no trace of the colliery in the village. Even the air was fresh these days. The once seemingly indelible acrid stench from the coke ovens long since dispersed. I remember Mam phoning me, I said, the day they announced it was closing. I was on The Guardian by then. The features editor packed me off to Withen with a photographer to put together a colour piece, a personal reflection on the village where I'd grown up and the death of its coal mine. 800 words. Never seen a site cleared so quick, my uncle said. You came back in 92? He'd already been gone 7 years by then. Just to see it one last time. Only it went out but a big wasteland with a JCB levelling it off. He steered into a turn. Christ, when I think of the years I spent under there. What did you do? I asked, after you left. We were heading up the high street with its pound shops and charity shops, betting offices and loan dealers. People were eating at tables on the pavement outside the chippy. Bit of labouring, he said, cab driving, this and that. Last few years, before I retired, I were a car park attendant at Sheffield Hallam Uni. Professor of parking, my girls called me. The gears crunched as he shifted up. How about you? You still on papers? No, I'm a journalism lecturer now at Goldsmiths. Funny how we both ended up working in higher education, he said, and laughed. Then he asked if I were still a union man. I told him I was, for all the good it did, seeing as the management paid us little or no attention. Hardly anyone turns up at branch meetings anyway, I said. Me included, I might have added. We have a one-day strike, they dock us a day's pay, then we all carry on as if nothing had happened. Uncle Peter asked if Dad found work when the pit closed. Not then, I tell him. For the next 9 years, Dad was on benefits. Then, just as he hit retirement age, Asda took him on part-time, rounding up the trolleys, emptying the waste bins, tidying the delivery bay and recycling area, that sort of thing. It affected his pension, but he was glad to be doing something. It was apparent that Uncle Peter knew none of this. By the time we followed Susie into the restaurant car park, we'd gone quiet. His knuckles, misshapen by arthritis, were white where he gripped the steering wheel. Didn't this used to be the Kestrel? It changed hands about 10 years ago, I said. What is it, Chinese? Thai. They serve English food as well, though. They'd have to round here, keep the UKIP voters happy. We'd parked. I unclipped my seatbelt. We'd have had to have a do at the welfare, but it's all boarded up, I said. Has been for years. Neither of us made a move to get out. Uncle Peter still had one hand on the wheel. I'll be with you in there, I said. You'll be all right. Without turning to look at me, he said, I only went to Crem to pay my respects, Matt. Say goodbye to him. That's all. I weren't planning on any of this. I know. Me neither. A few bays along, Susie, Ben and Laura had climbed out of the VW. My suit jacket was draped over Susie's arm. She looked hesitant, as if unsure whether to come over. Julie and Fiona were dead set against me coming at all, Uncle Peter said. Julie and Fiona, my cousins. Teenagers the last time I'd seen them. They would both be pushing 50 now. What you did that night, you and your brother, he trailed off, shook his head. The girls have never forgiven you for that. Sylvia never did either. That was us, not Dad. He knew you'd done it, though. I nodded. Yeah. Aye. I thought so. After a pause, he asked, I don't suppose he ever mentioned me when he were near end? I considered lying, but just said, no, he didn't. It came out harder than I intended. Susie was at the passenger door. My uncle pressed the button to lower the window, and a gust of heat entered the air-conditioned interior, along with traffic noise and cooking smells. Hello, she said, dipping her head to the window, smiley, breezy. I introduced them, and she reached awkwardly across me to shake Uncle Peter's hand. Do you mind taking Ben and Laura in? I said. We won't be long. Okay. She didn't look pleased about it. Nice lass, Uncle Peter said after she'd gone. Dad was always asking me if I knew how lucky I was. Don't blow it, he used to say. They won't find another one as good as Matt. They won't find another one as good, Matt. As I spoke his words, I heard him saying them. My jaw tightened, and it was all I could do not to cry right there in front of my uncle. I took a couple of breaths. She doesn't know about that night, or Ben and Laura. You never told him? He sounds surprised enough not to believe me. I didn't want them to know that about me. Uncle Peter sat with his hands in his lap, smashing his window was such a small matter, set against 30 years of cutting him and our aunt and cousins out of our lives. Do you ever regret going back? I asked. In 92? No. 84. He took so long to answer, I wondered if he would. Finally, he said, there hasn't been a day when I don't. Not one day. 1984. From her tone of voice, Mam might have been calling with news that someone had died. Your uncle has gone back, she said, just like that. Uncle Peter? How many other uncles have you got? He can't have. Rich and his mates saw him go past on scab bus not half hour since. I stared at the half-written feature sticking out of my typewriter, as if the meaning of what Mam had said might be encrypted among the words there. Are they sure it was him? with those grills at the window and the speed, I left this thought unspoken. They were sure. You didn't name someone unless you were certain. I just phoned Sylvia, Mam said. Well, what did she say? She hung up on me. There was a metallic taste in my mouth. Have you told Dad? Rich is with him now. It was mid-December. The strike had entered its 10th month and, although support was weakening in some areas, around 95% of South Yorkshire was still out. At Withen, Maine, you could count the strike breakers on one hand. Each day, under police escort, the bus ran the gauntlet, trailing cries of scab, the meshed glass spattered with phlegm. As I set the phone in its cradle, I pictured Uncle Peter's face at one of those windows, the thick black brows drawn taut over eyes that stared dead ahead. He wouldn't so much as flick a glance at the pickets jostling with the cordons of police just a few feet from the side of the bus as it sped past. He wouldn't spot my brother spotting him, but he would know he was there. My uncle had stood side by side with the men, with Rich, with my dad. Now he was one of the scabs. How can he see his own brother beaten to ground, see him where he is now, Mam had said on the phone? How can he see that and go back to work? She blamed Aunt Sylvia. While most of the women in the village had united behind the strike, Sylvia had distanced herself from all of that. At that Sunday dinner, not long after I'd returned from Hong Kong, my aunt had criticised Scargill for not calling a ballot. There were a ballot at every pit, Rich said. We voted with us feet. A proper one, Aunt Sylvia said, a national one. And let those cunts in Nottingham vote to shut down our coalfield. Mam rapped the table. Richard Marron, don't you dare use that word in this house. What? Nottingham? My brother replied. Mam glowered at him, staring him down. We'd have got more support from other unions and from public. This was Uncle Peter. He shrugged. All I'm saying is we gave press and Tories chance to say strike's not valid, to make us out to be nowt but a bunch of yobbos. Arthur knows what he's doing, Mam said. Calling a strike in spring? Aunt Sylvia asked. After NCB had built up coal stocks? After you'd all worked overtime for months to build up stocks for them? The argument continued. I took a back seat, not entitled to join in. I'd moved away. I didn't work down the mine. I wasn't going short of food or struggling to pay bills or being battered by the police on the picket lines. Away from Withen, though, my semi-detachment made me more radical. At work, whenever I entered the newsroom, the other journos would chant, Maggie, 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 ow, ow, ow. Aged 23, I was elected father of chapel and proposed a motion at the next NUJ branch meeting that we should come out on strike in support of our comrades in the National Union of Mine Workers. The motion was defeated. Looking back, I could see that I was seeking to assuage my guilt, like a man who had escaped from a sinking ship. That I was seeking, albeit unconsciously, some kind of acceptance from my brother, from Mam and Dad, from myself, that I was still one of them, that I wasn't too clever for Withen. By the time I went home for Christmas, Uncle Peter had been back at work 2 weeks. Have you spoken to him? I asked Dad. Why would it do that? To ask why he's gone back. I know why. Because they skin, he said. Mam said my uncle's and aunt's electricity and gas had been cut off, and my cousins were going to school in clothes and shoes they'd outgrown, and that the younger one, Fiona, had been diagnosed by the doctor as malnourished. Like no other family in Withen is in the same boat, she said, or rest of Yorkshire, or South Wales, or Durham, or Scotland. Peter's made his choice. or had it made for him by Sylvia. It was the worst of choices. We weren't a religious family, but it carried the weight of a commandment in our house and throughout the mining communities. Thou shalt not scab. On Christmas Eve, Rich and I went round to my uncle's house and did what we did. I'd like to blame it on the beer, but we weren't too drunk to know what we were up to. I'd like to say I tried to dissuade my brother, but I didn't. Once the village got wind of what we'd done to one of our own, it was open season on Uncle Peter. In the following weeks, other windows were smashed. Dog shit was pushed through the letterbox. The shed in the backyard was set alight. Scab and scum were daubed on the front door and on the chipboard panels he's fixed over the windows. If they ventured into the village, my uncle, aunt and cousins were sworn at, spat at. Julie and Fiona were frozen out at school, friendless. In the shops, no one would serve Aunt Sylvia. One evening, when he went to the end of the street to post a letter, Uncle Peter was set upon by 3 men and beaten so badly he spent nearly as long in hospital as Dad had done. I can't say whether my brother was responsible for some or any of these incidents. He always insisted that he wasn't. I said all I had to say when I stood in the garden after we'd done his windows. From that night on, they were dead to us. 2014. In the lobby of the Emerald Buddha sat a wooden Buddha painted green. A serene, slimline Siddhartha Gautama, not the fat, jolly version. He was in the lotus position, hands configured in a symbolic gesture that I might once have been able to interpret. I ushered my uncle into the bar area, expecting a scene from a Western, where a crowded saloon falls silent. But there were a few turned heads, that was all. I couldn't immediately spot my brother. Beer? I asked Uncle Peter. Not when I'm driving. It spills going round bends, I said, supplying the punchline to one of his gags. You remember me jokes then? They're all in the British Museum now. He gave a wheezy laugh. We were passing through the throng. Uncle Peter struggling due to his hip. I muttered excuse me and thanks as people made way for us. I'll come to the bar with you, he said, sticking close to me. It's all right, I pointed. Susie and Artu are over there. As I steered him in their direction, we came upon Mam, sitting with a neighbour from the sheltered housing. They had glasses of sherry in front of them. We both paused as if it had been our purpose all along to approach the table. Her semi-vacant gaze settled on each of us in turn, and I heard her murmur to the woman beside her. Who's that chap with my Don? It's me, Mam, Matt. She smiled at me as if I'd said something silly. Mam, this is Uncle Peter. What did he say? She asked her companion. Uncle Peter, I repeated. He came to pay his respects to Dad. You had a brother called Peter, she said, addressing my uncle. Then to a friend. I were a bridesmaid at their wedding. Don were best man. She looked up at Uncle Peter. What were her name, love? Peter's wife. Sylvia, Uncle Peter said quietly. Mam frowned, took a sip of sherry. No, that weren't it. She lost interest in us. We stood there pointlessly for a moment before moving on. Poor bloody woman, my uncle said. When you think how she used to be. On my way to order drinks, I passed the seating plan at the entrance to the dining area. 20 tables, 4 on each. Me, Susie, Ben and Laura had been put together at one of the top tables. We'll be calling everyone through in a few minutes, sir. It was the maitre d', indicating our table on the plan. I said, sorry to be a nuisance, but could you lay an extra place at number 2, please? I was at the bar when Rich drew up beside me. He gazed straight ahead at the Spirit Optics. "What you doing, Matt?" Casual. He might have been asking me to recommend a whiskey. Buying our uncle an orange juice. My brother gave me a sidelong look. "It's been 30 years, I said. Once a scab. Christ, Rich, spare me the fucking cliches. Cliche, right. He placed his hands on the edge of the counter, as if about to perform a set of bench presses. "You're going to announce it. Make another of your speeches." I let that go. We don't have the right to turn a man away from his brother's funeral. There. Jot it down on one of them fucking cards of yours so you don't forget it. The barmaid set an orange juice and a pint in front of me. If she'd heard what we'd said, you wouldn't have known. She'd smiled before when I greeted her with "Sawat-dee," but politely, as if humouring me. I was glad that Rich hadn't been there to witness that. "Or are you going to flog a piece to the Guardian?" my brother asked, when she'd moved away to serve someone else. "The uncle who came in from the cold." "Do you remember him making a set of battery-operated floodlights for your Sabutio picture?" said. "Or when he used to take us tobogganing at Rother Valley? Or him stopping Dad from giving you a belting that time you..." "I remember him crossing the picket line," Rich cut in. "Going back to work when Dad was still having blackouts from where that bastard copper had napped him." You can't blame Uncle Peter for what happened to Dad. "We lost strike because of cunts like him." I shook my head. The strike was already lost by the time he went back. "Oh, aye? Well, that word on the street then, Matt, down in fucking London?" Our raised voices had drawn the attention of some of those standing nearby. We fell quiet for a moment. I sipped my pint. The beer was sharp and hoppy. We had blamed our uncle, me included, after he'd turned scab. We came to hold him responsible for the way Dad was after Orgreave. Uncle Peter left Withen, Maine, left mining in May '85, 2 months after the end of the strike. The men wouldn't work with him. He left the village then as well. Him, Aunt Sylvia, the 2 girls. They didn't tell anyone, they just went. Dad, meanwhile, stayed on at the colliery until it closed. But he wasn't able to do the same work as before. They took him off the face and put him above ground, onto the screens, sifting waste material from the coal that other men had mined. It was a job usually allocated to lads or old-timers or miners with disabilities. If he'd lost confidence after his head injury, the switch to unskilled work brought him lower still. None of it was Uncle Peter's fault, but we made a correlation between our father's decline and our uncle's absence, his betrayal. Dad never admitted as much, but with the loss of his brother, he'd lost a vital piece of himself. "What do you think Dad would have made of this place?" I asked. Rich frowned as if taking a moment to adjust to the change of subject. "They used to come here for Sunday lunch sometimes, him and Mam. Seriously." I took in the black and gold decor, the diffused lighting, the low-slung furniture, the wall prints of seated, standing and reclining Buddhas. Bangkok meets IKEA. "They do a proper carvery," Rich said. "Special rate for OAPs. Dad was always one for a carvery. Pile it high and shovel it down." Rich didn't have anything to say to that. We lapsed into another, briefer silence. "I'm going to take his drink over," I said finally. "Leave it where it is," my brother said, "and take him back to his car." "No, Rich, I'm not doing that." We were 8 and 10, kicking a ball in the back lane, 12 and 14 in the school playground. We were 21 and 23 in Uncle Peter's garden on Christmas Eve, 1984. Rich stared at the glass of orange juice, as if debating whether to send it crashing to the floor. But his hands remained braced against the bar. His shoulders relaxed. Looking at me square in the face, he said, "Dad wouldn't have wanted him here." "Probably not, no." Rich nodded. You always were a selfish fucker, Matt. In the corner, Susie had managed to snaffle a seat for Uncle Peter. He sat with one leg bent, the other straight out in front of him. She was squatting beside his chair, showing him the photos she kept in the purse of her Ben and Laura when they were little. I handed my uncle his drink. "All right," Susie asked. She must have seen me talking to Rich. "Yeah," I said. "Everything's sorted." 18th of June, 1984. I can only piece this together from the fragments I've been told and from my imagination. They leave Withen after first light in Uncle Peter's brown Allegro, the one with the boot that won't shut when it's open and won't open when it's shut. My uncle drives. Dad sits in the front passenger seat. My brother is in the back. Rich had joined the picket at the coking plant several times in the preceding weeks, but this is the first time for Dad and Uncle Peter. They're in a convoy streaming out of the village. A glorious day is forecast, but the sun has yet to dissolve the slicks of mist in the fields. The men's breath steams up the windows, and my uncle steers one-handed as he wipes the windscreen with a grubby yellow chamois. Dad will be craving a cigarette, but smoking isn't allowed in the car, by order of Aunt Sylvia. Rich rubs his palms on his thighs, the way he does when he's nervous. Dad hums under his breath. Tom Jones, the green, green grass of home. He doesn't realise he's doing it. Half a world away in Kowloon, it's lunchtime. Becca and I are grabbing a bite to eat between tutorials. I doubt I'll be giving my dad, my brother, my uncle, a moment's thought. "Let's have some music," Uncle Peter says, turning on the radio. Over whichever song he's playing, he asks us if they brought packed lunches. Snap, he calls it, and Dad snorts and says, "What is this, Pete? A fucking school trip?" They all laugh. "Hey, Richard," my uncle glances in the rearview mirror. "Nice perm, by the way." "It's not a perm," my brother says. "I thought it was Kevin Keegan in the back for a minute there. It's not a fucking perm." Looks like one from where I'm sat. Rich doesn't say anything, just scowls out of the car window. "Well, I reckon it suits him," Dad says. "All he needs is a spandex suit and he could enter Eurovision." "It's not a perm, all right," Rich says. "It's a fucking demi-wave." There's a brief pause. Then all three of them are laughing like it's the funniest thing they've ever heard. They're still laughing when the news comes on. Uncle Peter shushes the other two. The newsreader refers to the strike, entering the 16th week. Perhaps in relation to this item, or a different one, the Prime Minister's husky, carefully modulated tones issue from the speaker. Rich leans forward between the front seats, intending to turn off the radio, but my uncle has beaten him to it. Thatcher falls abruptly silent. That fucking woman. This will be Dad. He can't hear her voice or see her face without calling her that fucking woman, or that woman, if Mum's around. I picture him glaring at the dial as if the radio is responsible for Thatcher, or as if Thatcher herself is hidden behind the black plastic fascia and might start speaking again. Even with radio off, I can still hear that voice, Rich says. She could be dead in her grave, Uncle Peter says, and we'd still not shut her up. The convoy crests a hill, opening up a sweeping view towards Sheffield. The motorway, the twin cooling towers at Tinsley, and there, the coking plant, glinting through the risen sun like a space station from the cover of a sci-fi magazine. Here we go, boys, my uncle says. Rich takes it up quietly at first. Here we go, here we go, here we go. Uncle Peter joins in. Here we go, here we go, here we go. Then Dad, here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go. Rich is beating out the rhythm on his knee. Dad is rapping the dashboard. Uncle Peter thumping the steering wheel with the heel of his hand, Three voices united as one. Here we go, here we go, here we go. Here we go, here we go, here we go. Here we go, here we go, here we go. Here we go, here we go. 2014. The maitre d' banged a small gong and invited us all to take our seats for lunch. Our corner of the bar was farthest away, so most of the other mourners had already gone through by the time the five of us filed into the restaurant. The top tables stood beneath the far windows. Sunshine streamed in, brilliant against the white walls and tablecloths. The Withen main lodge banner hung from a wall, huge, dominant, its reds, yellows and purples shimmering. The portrayed figures so etched with brightness, they were translucent, ghost-like. The last time I'd seen it was on the 3rd of March, 1985, swaying on poles at the head of the procession through the village as the men, my father and brother among them, returned to work at the end of the strike. They marched behind Withen's colliery band, heads held so high you would think they'd won. We have won, Dad said that day. You only lose if you don't fight. As we approached the top tables, I was peripherally aware of Mam and Rich, Tanya and their kids, already in their seats, watching us. I led the way, then Uncle Peter, with Susie at his side, helping him, followed by Ben and Laura. So I was the first one to see what had been done. The table was stripped. No chairs around it, no tablecloths draped over it, no placemats, no plates, no knives and forks, no spoons, no wine glasses, no water glasses, no napkins, no jug of water, no basket of bread rolls, no butter dish, no salt, no pepper, no small vase of flowers, no name cards. Just a number 2 clipped to a stand in the centre of the bare wooden table.
Christopher, thank you so much. Can't thank you enough for joining us this evening and for reading Martyn's story.
Well, thank you to Martyn.
Really appreciate your solidarity tonight. We will give you a well-deserved rest and pop you into the audience. We know you have other things to do, but we've got you a great virtual seat next to Leslie and Elsie in the audience.
Okay. How do I do that? Do I just click on the link?
My colleague will switch you over. And
okay.
So as long as you can stay with us, and Leslie and Elsie, it'd be lovely to have you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you ever so much. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
So we're now going to have a discussion with Martyn Bedford and with Martyn and with Dave. And I think, and me sticking my elbow in, but not too much. Martyn and Dave, it's clear from this story, from what you've both written, I think to all of us, that Orgreave is unfinished business as the ongoing fight being courageously led by the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign, and so many people shows us. I guess I'd like to start by asking a really simple question of both of you. Dave, who was at Orgreave, Martyn, who has put himself there through the power of imagination. I'd like to know, what do you both understand now about Orgreave that you didn't then?
Can I pass that one in your direction first, Dave?
My direction. Well, at the moment, I'm sitting, 400, 500, 600 meters away from Hillsborough Stadium. And I think that it's often, very, very difficult for me to think of Orgreave without thinking about the more general context of policing in the sort of 1980s and particular events that happened at Hillsborough in the wake of Orgreave, and the way that South Yorkshire Police has been struggling ever since then to sort of disavow themselves of a particular reputation and a particular infamy that's been involved in those two events. I think that with hindsight, you know, and I mean now we're in the age of citizens journalism and social media, etc. It would be very interesting to reconsider Orgreave in the light of contemporary availability of information and discussion and what have you. Because I think that, you know, what you got to remember about Orgreave is that it was a saga rather than a day's event. Actually, you know, it took off sometime in, I think, May 27th or something like that. And there were two huge events, perhaps on a greater scale, and a greater magnitude than the 18th of June. And I think those were almost, I think, the attempt by the police, by the government to resist Orgreave becoming another Saltley Gate, which had been so symbolic of the 1972 miners' strike. And I think that they, you know, that they would, on that particular occasion, they were there to sort of drive the miners into the ground. I think by the time it got to the 18th, I think that the miners had taken the police by unawares, to be honest with you, and the police hurriedly assembled their troops. But I think once there, it was almost like, you know, those sods have got us back again. You know, let's get everybody together. And on that day, there was a police riot. And I think that it's not so much what happened on the day as the reporting of it, which has been proven and dissected and shown to be so impartial and unimpartial, should I say, and unfair. It was a travesty of what happened. If you know, if ever you were there, and the sequence of events was ridiculed, to be honest with you. So there was that, but there's also the testimonies that came out in the subsequent trial of people who were brought up there on trumped-up charges that could have led to life imprisonments. And I think that the lesson that really put the police to shame, and I think they know it with hindsight, there's a lot of revisionism going on. I mean, I've taught on MAs in public disorder, MSCs in Hong Kong, as a matter of fact, as well. And I think that the revisionism that's going on is the police are saying, well, actually, you know, we were duped. You've got to forgive us. And I think there's a reevaluation. I think that the whole media, the whole legacy of the Conservatives, bad as it was for as far as most people are concerned. But I think that the police are now striving really to restore a sense of legitimacy and a confidence, the public confidence in them.
Martyn, let's talk about the media. You were a news reporter for 15 years. The events that this story is about took place when you were a young journalist. Knowing what we know now about the reporting of events such as this, so many other places where the state and police have been a repressive force and have been these events have been misreported. How do you feel about your journalistic colleagues? Do you remember, like Matt in the story, seeing how it was reported? Did you believe it? How do you feel now about the role of the media in this country in suppression and in cover-ups?
Well, it's the dispiriting thing is that we're not in a better place now than we were then in many ways. I mean, some things are different. I think there's been a democratization of news now. People have got mobile phones with them. Protests and demonstrations and disorder along the lines of Orgreave couldn't happen in quite the same way now, because hundreds of people would be filming it. So the police would have to behave differently or be caught behaving in the way that they did. The media would be hard pushed to report it in a distorted way. I mean, one of the points that Dave makes very well in his accompanying essay in this book is that the events, the sequence of events was misrepresented by the media on the BBC News, that they filmed it in such a way that it looked as if the police were responding to having been pelted with missiles by the pickets, whereas in fact it was the other way around. The police initiated the violence by charging the pickets, who then responded by throwing missiles. But the BBC showed that footage the other way around to create a kind of narrative. And we see this all the time, don't we? Political parties are particularly skillful at creating a narrative or a public discourse that becomes very hard to sort of disprove or shake once it's taken a popular hold. So as an ex-journalist, I find it I mean, I was aware of the shortcomings within journalism, and I was aware of the misleading of the way things were covered, and it wasn't a comfortable place to work. And I don't feel any more enamored of it now that I've left, really. And I think one of the problems I have at the moment is in the ongoing situation with the pandemic, is that again we're seeing this failure to report things properly, or allowing people in authority to dictate a narrative that the sort of journalists seem to fall in line behind. I don't think it serves the public good for that to be the case, for the press to be seen as being an organ of the state in that way.
Now, this story ends in a very shocking way, clearly demonstrating that there's no closure. I'm sure it would be tempting as a writer to look for a message where there's some forgiveness and some closure. So it is quite painful to read and to face the fact that it's not going to end with everyone hugging and saying, "Oh, that's all right then." Was that a choice to represent the fact that with Orgreave there very clearly is no closure?
Yes, I mean, I think these situations are far too complicated for a simplistic or pat resolution, really, with all the loose ends neatly tied up in a bow. I think it would be, readers wouldn't buy that for a start. The divisions that were caused within families involved in the strike were so ingrained and so bitter and so long lasting that it would be unrealistic to have everything end happy families. And also I wanted it to be deliberately ambiguous for the reader to know who they should be rooting for in a story. Whose side are we on here? Matt is the sort of hero in inverted commas of the story because he's our narrative viewpoint, but he's very flawed and inadequate character in a lot of ways, and by the end of the story we're not really too sure whether we're on his side, whether we're on his brother's side, whether we side with his uncle or his dad. And I deliberately wanted to leave those ambiguities there to give the readers space to come to their own conclusions. As a reader, I don't like it when the author tries to tell me what I should think. I prefer to leave the ambiguities there for the reader to come to their own conclusions.
And Dave, you had the opportunity in working with Martyn and in providing the contextual afterward, where you look at some of the things that were presented in the story and you offer further context, particularly about shall we say, untruths that were presented at the time. How did you feel when the first time you read Martyn's story? I assume you felt it was very important that a piece of fiction would live up to presenting an issue of this importance. Here's where you get to tell us that you thought it was good.
I think that the admiration was at so many levels. I think the characterization, for one thing. I mean, just to tell co-participants in this that I was actually born in the mining town of Castleford, you know, where at the time, just round in the town itself and on the periphery, there were probably 10 pits at the time of the miners' strike. And as we know, Kellingley, which was pretty close to my birthplace, was the last deep mine to be closed in the country. I think that it captured, first of all, the mining culture and the sense of humour and you know, and the sights and sounds of Orgreave. I mean, some of those things I think actually stemmed from the pre-conversation that I had with Martyn, the preliminary conversation about feeling the horse's hooves as you're running away. You know, it was you laughed hysterically. You know, I was probably the good side of 30, if I can put it that way, and I was running for my life. But there were guys, older guys, who were pulling back, saying, "Stop it, young'un! Give us a hand and whatever." You know, and you were telling. I remember 3 of us. I don't know. Some people probably remember a series from long ago called Follyfoot, and there was this so-called lightning tree. And it was a dead tree, and 3 of us were huddled under this tree. And I always remember this guy coming back with the big baton, and it actually, the branch tore the side of the horse, and there was this crimson zip from its head to its backside, the thing. But we were terrified at that case. You know, there were people who were literally peeing themselves as they were running away. The thing about Asda, he mentions was it Peter coming out of, or Don coming out of the Asda? There's an Asda very close to Orgreave, and I remember running away with these other guys, and the police horse galloped, and it took a left, and it followed these guys who it clearly thought were some of the main perpetrators, the stone throwing, etc. And it came, and you know how you approach a supermarket door and the door slide open. This guy on the horse ducked as if to say, I'm going to chase these buggers down the biscuit aisle. And he turned round and had another go. You know, I remember you telling that to you, Martyn, and you know, in our conversation. But there were sights and sounds like that. And on the 18th, we were chased right up Handsworth Hill. And I remember huddling by these sort of IKEA flat pack boxes with a guy from Derbyshire. You know, and we were scared stiff, and there was these guys walking by that looked like something out of Star Wars. So I can't sort of, you know, begin to express the admiration I feel for him for that. But I think there are nuances in there as well. And I think this, he mentioned ambiguity. I love the ambivalence in there, because I don't think that it's very healthy to look at the strike and treat everything, you know, it's like, you know, mention of the ballot, etc. That became something of a shibboleth during the strike. But I've got relatives in my extended family who were thinking, why? You know, they stayed out for a year, but why no ballot? And I think those things need addressing with hindsight, you know. And I think that Martyn has given voice to people who we might not agree with, but I do think that it's important that we hear those voices and give them proper consideration.
Could I, thanks very much for your kind words about the story, Dave. I should say a couple of things. Firstly, that story wouldn't have been possible to be written in the way that it was without the conversations that Dave and I had before at the outset of this project, because he'd been there and he'd witnessed it, and a lot of the colour and the detail and the atmosphere and the mood of the occasion and of the community at that time came from the conversations I had with Dave that I couldn't have, you know, you can look stuff up on YouTube and you can look stuff up in newspaper cuttings, but you can't replicate speaking to someone who was there at the time. And so a lot of the story came from those conversations. But the other thing I wanted to say as well is that in these times when the debate about any political issue seems to become so polarized and so black and white, we're right and you're wrong, and the hostility and the animosity that comes with that. We've seen it played out in America recently, but it's happening here all the time. I think that's even more important for writers and commentators to include ambiguity into these matters rather than try and continually dichotomize things into right versus wrong, black versus white. Life isn't like that. And I think we need to bring back that blurring of the lines between polarized opposites so that we can have a conversation rather than a conflict.
Although when you're talking about blurring the lines, clearly we may be talking about the differences of opinion between people in mining communities, but there's someone else in that marriage, namely the role of the government at the time and the system as it was, and clearly the divisions between family members, as you detail here, show that the cost of the conflict is born within the community. I assume when you're talking about shades of grey, you're not talking about the toxic role played by Thatcher's government in this, or do you see any ambiguity there? Were they doing their best?
Well, I don't think you'd ever hear me say I thought Thatcher's government were doing their best. But I think I mean, clearly, you know, I've tried to disguise where my political colours lie in this story, but on a personal level, I mean, I never thought I could hate a prime minister as much as I hated Thatcher, although I'm finding it easier to do that now, I have to say. But I think what probably got under my skin more than anything during that period was the sort of contempt and disdain that the government of the day seemed to feel towards working people, and the deliberate attempt, as one of my characters says, to carry out an assault on working people. I think there was a a sort of sense of gaining revenge on Thatcher's part for what the miners had done to Ted Heath's government in the 70s. And I think more than any other union, she wanted to bash the miners. But you see it now, the Conservatives, through their austerity measures over the last 10 or 15 years, the contempt in which they hold working people who are on benefits, people who belong to unions, the people who work in the gig economy. Whatever the political crisis might be, it's the people at the bottom of the pile who come off worse. And that's, I think, fundamentally because Conservative policy brings that about. It creates an ethos where that's an acceptable way of treating people. That's not something I'd ever spell out in those kinds of words within a story, because stories operate differently. But as a person, as a politically active human being, that's my take on that situation, really. Yeah.
Martyn, obviously, as a journalist, one has the opportunity, ideally, to explore stories, to understand, to represent. As a fiction writer, you have the power of your creativity to imagine worlds, to explore issues. But David, as an academic, you were in Orgreave because of participant observation. Obviously, in the academic world, fields people choose to work in or end up working in often tells you something about their view of the world, their politics, their understanding of where power lies and where oppression is. We'll obviously see differences between Lisa Mackenzie, the ethnographer who is with us tonight, or you, and some people that I see in other kinds of departments. But what about the role of the activist academic? What about the issues that you face if you were politically engaged in the academy? The need to not reveal your colors, the need to be an objective observer. Is that possible? Do you defend the role of the activist academic or the politically engaged academic?
I think that sort of detachment is impossible, and I make no apologies for it. But I think that I was a supporter of the strike. I willed the strike. I wanted to believe everything that fellow activists were saying, etc. At the end of the day, there is an inbuilt mechanism. I'm a social scientist rather than a historian, and there's an inbuilt mechanism that says, well, what you got to do is you got to weigh up the evidence. And it's like the singer said, the more I find out, the less I know. I think that it's healthy to have that sort of ambivalence. I wrote a couple of years ago an essay of the miners' strike, and I called it cock up or conspiracy theory. And a bit like Martyn, but for different reasons, I think I made a conclusion, but the conclusion wasn't definitive. It was, because to be honest with you, I felt, and I think I felt for rhetorical purposes, that the whole miners' strike was a conspiracy, and it was planned, and it was executed with precision in some sort of a kind of Gramscian theory would have put it all together, etc. I don't know now that I want to give Mrs. Thatcher that much credit for it. I think that the evidence I've looked at from memoirs, etc., suggests that the Conservatives were very tentative about the possibility of miners' strike. They didn't want it. McGregor was brought in to do a job, but not by Mrs. Thatcher. She kicked and screamed against it. It was Nigel Lawson who brought McGregor in. There's this famous phrase to Peter Walker: Peter, I want you to go over to Energy. We're going to have a miners' strike. Peter Walker says in his memoirs, well, I actually went over there to be the cosy, avuncular figure who would prevent the rank and file from forming behind Mr. Scargill and Mr. Heathfield, for example. And I think, if you follow it through, I'm not saying that I wholeheartedly subscribe to a cock-up theory, but I think that there are shades of both that are persuasive.
But even if it wasn't a conspiracy, even if it wasn't planned, does that take away from the injustice?
Oh no, no. Well, that is an you know, an unavoidable conclusion. It would be remiss to say that. I think that once in there, and once having the accident of, you know, the unexpected rather than accidental, the unexpected bonus of the Nottinghamshire coalfield, the Midlands coalfield still being out, etc. And I think that they played all their cards. You know, they brought the editors on side. They banged their table and made sure that the police, who totally subscribed to the idea that, you know, that this was a revolutionary vanguard led by Mr. Scargill, and he was leading the miners by and their wives by the nose. That, you know, I think that was reinforced, and they played their hand in an almighty manner. So I think that the injustices there took off. But whether it was planned from the outside, there's a lot made in the book. There's a lot made of the Ridley report. You know, pile them high, switch to oil and coal at the power stations and things like that. There probably wasn't 1 in 200 of the Conservative MPs who'd heard of the Ridley Pan, let alone the government. You know, the government. But I think of more kind of persuasiveness to them was something written by I think he was the chair of the Civil Contingency Unit, a guy called Robert Wade Geary. His advice to the government was, don't give any possibility to Mr. Scargill and activists within the union to get the rank and file. You know, mollify the NUM as soon, or the NUM members as much as you can. Don't bring in massive redundancies all at once. Do it gradually, etc. And I think that was the mantra initially of the Conservative Party. So you know, I welcome any attempt to sort of review things and probably reassess them, which I think is always necessary for a major event like that.
Where do you think scholars, Dave and Martyn, journalists and writers, need to be looking to tell us about Orgreave, about issues, about the working class, the destruction of communities? What should be being written about and thought about and studied that isn't?
Well, I think we need to revisit some of the previous injustices that still haven't been resolved. Orgreave, for example, Hillsborough is still unresolved. These are sort of decades old, but they're still not properly dealt with, and issues that have arisen from those episodes have resonances down the years. You only have to look at the situation since Grenfell. The numbers of people who are still living in high-rise buildings that are death traps, that still hasn't been resolved. I mean, it's a national disgrace and that's relatively recent history. You look back to Orgreave and Hillsborough still being unresolved now, and of course, as Dave makes in the point in his essay, the events of Hillsborough have a direct correlation with what went on and wasn't dealt with at Orgreave, the police collusion over evidence, the sort of denigration or demonizing of people who are victims of a tragedy as if they were somehow the perpetrators of it. That was a replica. The same police force, the same dynamics were being played out there. This has happened throughout history in recent times, and going back further, this book that we're here to talk about tonight, Protest, the recurring theme in a lot of these protests that are covered, which go right back to the Peasants' Revolt, right up to the anti-Iraq war demo and all points in between, is the recurring theme is that the working class, often northern people, are victims of situations in which they are then portrayed as being the perpetrators, and that there's an insufficient degree of sympathy or an insufficient will to bring justice because of the nature of who the victims are. So I think if you're a long way around of answering your question, I think journalists, I won't speak on behalf of academics or researchers, Dave can speak to that, but journalists and writers, I think, need to allow these things to always be in the public domain, to bring the public attention to these things again and again and again, and not to just draw the line under that and say, oh, well, that's ancient history, it happened 30 or 40 years ago, let's move on. We need to not allow that to happen. I'm
brought in mind of a comment made in the chat box this evening from Suzanne Owen, saying that several colleagues of hers are taking the British citizenship right to settlement type quizzes, the pub quizzes. I did the Tory pub quiz to get my citizenship, and it was an awful lot about Olympic medals. I think what this book shows is there are, I'm sure Martyn, as someone writing for young adults as well as proper grown-ups, you see there are many things that we are not taught in school.
Well, that's another good point as well. I mean, when I work at a university at Leeds Trinity University as a creative writing lecturer, but I think in schools, in colleges, and universities, we need to look at what the curriculum consists of and what we're teaching, and more importantly, what we're not teaching. So many aspects of history are not being taught, and that citizenship test is a sort of an illustration of that in a way, isn't it? That what we regard as our values of what Britishness is. I mean, it's nothing that I would subscribe to there, for sure.
Dave, what are your thoughts as a lecturer as well as researcher? Are the people who are studying labour history, for example, perhaps there are people who already have an interest in it. What about the people who would never touch that? Surely they're the ones who need to understand a little more about it.
I think that I think that there is a desire. I mean, I'm speaking. I've got I've got a 42-year-old son, but I've also got stepdaughters in their early 30s, etc. And I think that they're all more open to this kind of discussion, because I think that the nature of politics, where it's been issue oriented. I mean, one of the things we talked about in terms of the police, suddenly in the late 1980s, 1990s, there were environmental issues. There were protests against the export of live animals, and very often these were mature, middle-class women on picket lines who were being bundled over by the police. And I think that, that there were middle-class parents who were finding that the police were going in hard on rave parties, and there were environmental protests, etc., where the police were using anachronistic tactics. So I think that people understand it, and I think that with that understanding, I've talked about revisionism. I think that people sort of look backwards and reevaluate, what happened in the poll tax, what happened in the African Caribbean communities in the early 1980s, and in particular the miners' strike, because it shines out like a beacon. So I think that people, young people are looking back, and spotting the resonance between what is happening in their lives now and what's gone before.
Thank you so much. We have so many fantastic questions here. I really appreciate everyone staying with us longer, and I see that pretty much all of you have. Martyn and Dave, if you wouldn't mind, we have some great questions from the audience. If you'd be willing to,
yeah, please do.
Willing to consider them. I'm finding myself going a bit backwards here. Christine and Nick asked. Realizing not everything could be included in the story, which was fabulous, here, but the crucial part played by the betrayals of the TUC and above all the Labour Party were critical. And their own view now is that had there been a Corbynite Labour Party around, the strike could have been won and can never be forgiven. Is this fair?
Well, Dave's the historian and will probably have a better take on that than I would. But my impression at the time was that that Labour and the TUC did not support the miners as in the way that they needed to for it to have a chance of success. That was my impressionistic view of the situation. But as I say, Dave has made a study of that period and will probably have a much better insight into that than I could offer.
I think, yeah. I mean, one of the you asked me. The question, Karen, earlier about, you said, yeah, but whether this was cock up or conspiracy, that you can't deny the injustice. And I think that events, attitudes, interpretations have got consequences. And I think that kind of alienation of the NUM by not the trade union movement per se, but the the heads of the trade union, the people we would look upon for leadership in those days, the way that the media portrayed it, the way that the ballot was presented, etc. I think that they've all got consequences. Orgreave had consequences. Orgreave gave the police carte blanche, a license to go into the communities, to pick off the activists, to intimidate, to bear down and portray the ensuing sort of resistance that happened there as further evidence of, the yobbos within their midst, as they were portrayed. So I think, I think that what probably a lot of us found unforgivable, about the outspokenness of the criticism of the TUC and the leadership of the Labour Party was that it had consequences.
Thank you. We've got a question from Lindsay, which sort of leads on from that. Do you feel that the miners' strike was a key political situation that polarised communities in a way that changed us and has lingered and returned, for example, with Brexit?
Are you taking that one? Am I taking that one?
Well, that seems like your field again, Dave. I know we're playing a game of blink here, but yeah, over to you on that one.
Hospital pass, thank you. Yeah, I think there's no denying it. Something happened afterwards. Ironically, I think it was in those split communities, like Derbyshire. I'm thinking of places like Bolsover, where Dennis Skinner's constituency, where they were split. They were split. It was almost right down the middle in terms of supporting and working during the strike, etc. And there was a steady trickle back. I think communities like that, ironically, have accommodated. But I think that what you were left with was the sort of the kind of psychological legacy, which is a difficult one in many communities. Of I got to the stage of having relatives who wouldn't talk to me about the miners' strike. They'd been out for a full year, and they should, and I thought this was a heroic struggle. You've taken your name, you're taking your place in history. But they were disenchanted by everything. They saw, what was the point of this when all we've got, as Martyn said, was charity shops and 6-minute tanning shops on the high street, and and jobs have gone to the wayside. And I think they've been looking round. And he mentioned something about people, voting UKIP. I mean, did you see the last election in Castleford, for example? Where they used to say, well, you could put up a donkey in a rosette and they'd get in. And Yvette Cooper, Castleford and Normanton, just scraped in by a couple of thousand. You look at the miners' gala and what happened that in Durham. It whittled down from sort of 250,000 to 9. I think that it did induce a real demoralization, and I think that people looked round and pointed the finger, not very advisedly, targeted certain sort of scapegoat groups and what have you, and very often I think drifted away from sort of organised politics.
I've got a question here from someone in the audience. This will be one for you, Martyn.
Okay.
What role do you think literature can play in shaping public memory of events like Orgreave?
Well, if I'm putting my optimistic hat on, I think writers have an opportunity to redirect the narrative away from the mainstream media's version of things. We can sort of nudge people into a different way of thinking and a different way of seeing through the kinds of things I was referring to earlier with introducing aspects of ambiguity or just holding up a different perspective on something that we get used to seeing within the tramlines of a particular view. I think literature, the arts generally have that capacity. to make people think differently. But in my more pessimistic moments, I think, well, writers and artists and other creative people have been doing this for generations, and yet there still seems to be unresolved issues in society that prevail. You know, the number of books that have been written about the Holocaust and films that have been made about the Holocaust, and yet anti-Semitism hasn't gone away. And seems to be on the rise again now. Supporters of right-wing political parties, populist parties around the world seem to be on the rise again. So despite all of the literature and arts and so on that's created to try and move the narrative on, that narrative persists, and it's very hard to erase it. But I don't think that means you should stop the attempt. One of the lines, that, if I can quote from my own story, which is probably not a good thing to do, one of the lines at the end is when Matt's dad says, we haven't lost, you only lose if you don't fight. And I think writers have to keep persevering in the face of sometimes disappointing odds.
Here's a question for both of you. For the younger generation who will not remember these events, and I'm struck by the fact that, you know, there are so many people alive born after this. And when we were talking about this event with my colleagues at Housmans before, we were thinking about how to frame it for people who will have only the haziest memory. So to both of you, for the younger generation who won't remember these events, what would you recommend as a starting point for understanding the events of that time and its impact on the class struggle?
Well, I think they could start by looking at some events that they will be familiar with that are happening around them, and that hopefully a lot of them are participating in. The Extinction Rebellion protests, the Black Lives Matter protests. We're seeing echoes of the sort of dynamics and false narratives that were created back in the 80s are replaying themselves now. So a good starting point to venture back into historical disputes is to look at current disputes and work out the sort of trajectory, the evolution of those disputes, and see where their roots are. You know, what does give me heart is how many people of a younger generation, I've got daughters myself who are in their late teens and early 20s, and it heartens me to see how many people from that generation are becoming politically active now. So I would say start where you're at now and look at current disputes, and then work your way back and see where these things originate from.
Dave?
That probably sounds anathema to Dave, who's more of a historian than I am. You probably think about starting in the past and working forward, don't you, Dave?
No, I don't think so. I think ironically, I think it would be easier. You know, I mean, I remember the great sort of Scottish folk singer Dick Gaughan. He was saying during the miners' strike, he played the Blackleg Miner, and everyone was clapping over their heads, etc. Then he played the Ballad of '84, you know, which was a critique of Thatcher and McGregor's role in it, etc. And people started walking out of the door, you know, as if to say, oh, this is too close and this is too politicized, etc. I think that, like I say, I think that those touchstones are important, and I think that you know, we're only a couple of generations on from the miners' strike, and I think that means, you know, in my case, I've got grandchildren. You know, what was all the fuss about, Granddad? You know, what, etc. So I think that those lessons are still important. But I do agree. I think that, you know, one thing that I hope I haven't become is a gnarled old man, because I generally think, you know, I'm full of optimism for what, you know, the younger protest movements are bringing to the table these days. You know, it seems very enlightened, and it seems even more robust than it was, you know, back in the 80s.
Here's a question from Lisa McKenzie for both of you. Do you think that mining and miners are still stigmatized as dirty and wrong in light of the news about the pit in Cumbria, where the council are rethinking their decision to open it after political pressure?
I mean, my reading of that situation is not so much that there's an antipathy towards the miners or even mining per se. It's the environmental impact of burning fossil fuels is the issue now. I mean, the irony, the bitter irony of the attempt to save the pits from closure in the 80s and 90s is that environmental issues would have led to all the pits being closed in any case more recently. And my reading of that is not so much a dirty miners, dirty mining. It's the environmental impact of what you do. I mean, there's 300 years worth of coal under the ground in the UK still. You know, we could have 300 years worth of energy generated by coal if we reopen mines. But do we want to do that? Do we want to create the environmental impact that would come with that? That's the issue as I see it.
Dave?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I do think there was a conspiracy, at least a calculation. I think that you know, way back there were important decisions to be made about, you know, coal versus nuclear, and it wasn't as simplistic as the government a decision as the government were making it out to be. I think, for example, you know, the enormous subsidies that went into the nuclear industry to the detriment of coal were phenomenal. And I think that the contrast between, for example, what they did in the UK and what they did in Germany when they developed these immense desulfurization plans that would have eradicated a lot of the you know, the toxic elements that were entering the atmosphere. I don't think any of us would stand in opposition to you know, any of the conclusions that we've drawn on global warming, the dangers of fossil fuel, etc. But I think what it was always about was the compassion that went with change and the kind of vindictiveness. And I think that it was an opportunity to undermine trade union power. I think that was one of the considerations. But I also think, as I say, that it was that kind of you know, the legacy of it is the lack of compassion that went into the actual decimation of the communities, you know, and the sticking plaster that went on in British coal enterprise and things like that. I think that communities are still reeling from that. You know, progress is progress, but as long as it's compassionate and inclusive, and it's not done to coerce and disunify.
Which is why there are concerns that the likelihood of a just transition being just for any remaining industries that might need to be revised for environmental reasons.
Exactly.
Got a great question from Matt Kent. How do we reunite the voice of working people to give the strength of will that was shown during the miners' strike? And he adds, the number of friends and family that I grew up with in the middle of a strike who now associate more with right-wing and conservative values concerns me.
Yeah, well, it's a very difficult question to answer, isn't it? How we might bring about some kind of unity. I mean, an earlier question centred on the connection between Orgreave and what the legacy of that has been. For me, I think there's also a legacy of Thatcherism and the individualism and acquisitiveness and selfishness that went with her political philosophy that I think we're still living with the legacy of now. That there seems, I mean, she famously said there is no such thing as society, and I think the disintegration or the erosion of community and society, not just in mining communities, but in other contexts as well, is a legacy that comes from those Thatcher years. And it's a very hard repair job to do, particularly when you have people who would always have been regarded as traditional Labour supporting working people from those kinds of former communities who now will be prepared to vote in a Boris Johnson government despite 10 years of austerity measures by his Tory predecessors. My dad's been dead 14 years now, but he would be turning in his metaphorical grave at the thought of Labour voters turning to the Tories in the way that they have done. How you turn the tide back again or persuade them that Labour has something to offer them, there should be the grounds for that, because so many people now work in the gig economy, which has become a kind of a replacement for the old industries of coal and shipbuilding and steel and manufacturing. The gig economy has become the place where people are exploited by employers and work for poor pay and poor conditions, and that really should be a rich breeding ground for parties of the left or progressive parties to recruit and galvanize. But I'm not, sadly, I'm not seeing any sign of that happening. the sort of capitalist philosophy and economy is being very successful in pitting ordinary people against each other rather than against the real enemy here, I think. Sorry, that's a rather negative and pessimistic outlook, but I don't know how we can turn that round and unify.
Dave, any thoughts on that?
It's a difficult one. I went into about a year ago. I went into to my local florists, and there was a guy there, and he's an ex-miner, and he'd got a job delivering flowers, and there was a bit of banter going on, and he said to me, he says, "You know what that silly bugger over there is going to do? She's going to vote Corbyn." He says, "Jeremy Corbyn, you know." And I said, "Well, you know, tell me why you wouldn't." And it was almost a knee-jerk reaction. But for my money, I took such heart from the fact that, you know, the younger generation, my stepdaughters, etc., seem to embrace Corbynism. They seem to want a reinvigoration of the Labour Party, you know, and the new membership, etc. I think that the willingness is there. I think that I'm more optimism that I've been in ages as someone who's so scornful of New Labour, you know, and the hanging on to that sort of philosophy. I just think that the underpinning of it in terms of, you know, sort of trade union membership, in terms of the local organisation, etc. I don't know how that. I think it's there, ready to be harnessed, but I think it would take someone with a better grasp of grassroots politics than I've got to be able to say how it's going to be accomplished.
We've got just a couple more questions before we send you out into the metaphorical street outside wonderful Housmans. I should say that the mention of a gig economy by Martyn reminded me that I need to tell you about tomorrow night's event, which is the second of our 2 nights protest stories of resistance. And that will feature Maxine Peake, Maggie G, the author of the story that Maxine will be reading, and Sally Alexander, a scholar and feminist activist. And that centers on the night cleaners strike in 1972 through the lens of the present time and the people struggling to survive in the gig economy, and the sense in that story, as in so many places, that people are buying the idea that the gig economy gives them choice in a way that the Fordist model didn't. So that's tomorrow night at 7 p.m. There are still tickets available via housmans.com. 2 more questions for you, gentlemen, and thank you so much for staying up late for this. I
have to say, as a Leeds United fan, any excuse not to have to watch Man U on the telly is worth staying for.
Well, I'm glad we've done our best here.
Thank you.
One question from an anonymous attendee. Here's an interesting one. To what extent do you think toxic masculinity, or the idea that boys don't cry, played a role in the dreadful aftermath of the strikes?
Well, we've got 2 toxic men in the room here, haven't we? Which is, I feel slightly awkward about this, but it was a feature of my story for sure. The impediment of masculinity between the 2 older brothers, Don and Pete, and between Matt and Rich as well. The masculinity is a recurring impediment between them being the way they are and being the way they should be within themselves and within their families and within their communities. So I'm very conscious of that. Of what a poisonous thing that can be within families and within the community. So it certainly was a key theme, underlying theme in my story. I don't want to sort of extrapolate from that and say therefore that's what those communities are like, but certainly I wanted to highlight one particular family where that was the case. And I grew up in a home with it. My dad he wasn't a miner, he was a sheet metal worker in a factory, but he was very working class, lifelong Labour voter. He was the kind of guy of his generation who wouldn't open up to his emotions or admit that he had emotions. He wasn't tactile. He wouldn't give you a hug. You had to look very hard and deep to find the sort of emotional content there. And I, having grown up with that kind of a father, I'm aware of how masculinity can be such has had such an impediment, really. I don't know, in terms of its role within a wider community, I'll sort of pass that off to Dave if he's got any views on that. I know he's done a lot of research in mining communities and is much better aware of that than I might be.
Again, I don't want to I don't want to be too sort of cut and dried in what I'm saying. I think that there are many shades. I was in I had a heart operation 15 years ago, and I was in the bed opposite. There was a guy who was 77 years old at the time, and he'd been a worker in a Derbyshire mine during the strike, and he was as gentle as a lamb. And he, I don't think that there was any sort of, don't think you could have pointed the finger and said toxic masculinity there. I think he was a very gentle soul. I think that he thought, look, they're calling me a scab, and all I've got is a work ethic. I think that people come with different mindsets. And I think that as part of that, if you want to call it toxic masculinity, there's certainly that. There was two tribes. There was an occupational culture on the part of the police that was very unforgiving and macho, should I say? And on the other side, definitely, the miners par excellence having that value, but not right across the board. And I think that one of the facets of that was a kind of benign chauvinism. I mean, you were talking about people, not swearing in front of the mother and things like that. There's a kind of chivalry there that would probably still be offensive to cosmopolitan sensibilities, but there's a very profound respect, for what your mother might think, for what your sister might think, for what the woman opposite and I think that one of the flip sides of that is that there's a kind of paternalism there and a protectionism. And I think that to some degree was one of the things that animated a lot of those people who went back. Some people call them ideological scabs. Some people call them conscience scabs, hunger scabs. And I think that one of it was a bit like Uncle Peter. I got to look after my family. It might have been a misplaced sort of facet of the proletarian patriarch, as people in mining communities have sometimes been called. I think it was a very realistic yearning to do something, for the sake of the family who were suffering. Can I just say, there'll be a lot of people out there who, are from non-mining communities, etc. But there'll be people like me, academics. Think of the UCU strikes, or before that, maybe the NATFI strikes you were on. Think of the prospect of losing one day's pay. Think of having to sort of just think of how, there are people who are on the picket lines and you're saying, that person's never been to a trade union meeting in their life, and they're calling everybody brother and sister. Striking does something to you. It does something, and it generates a fear and a loathing, and and makes things very cut and dried. So yes, there were some sort of very spontaneous reactions. Yes, there were some very impulsive reactions. But I think that, for Christ's sake, it was a year-long strike like there's been no other.
Thank you. I've got one great question to end the evening with, but before I do that, I need to thank you again, both of you, for joining us this evening, for Christopher, for his wonderful reading of Martyn's story. I can't urge you all enough to look at Protest, Stories of Resistance, if you haven't yet bought it, and the companion volume, Resist. I understand there may be some more in the offing from the wonderful Comma Press. Also wanted to say a special thank you to Chris, the chair of the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign, for joining us this evening. And you can support the campaign at otjc.org.uk, or if you'd like to find out more about their work, we owe them a huge debt for their ongoing work. I'm sure everyone here feels the same way. Don't forget about tomorrow evening's event with Maxine, Peake, Maggie G, and Sally Alexander. And gentlemen, here's my last, by the way, and a chair's privilege, $25 a week strike pay. I spent a year on that, and my stepdad wanted to go back so my mum could put money on the table, put food on the table. So I absolutely hear you. The UK wasn't the only place where there are year-long minor strikes, I'll tell you that. So the final question, it was actually the first one that came in this evening from Pauline Anderson. What's the one fight we should be fighting in 2021 for a fairer society?
Okay. There are so many to pick from, aren't there, really? Unfortunately, there are so many things we're fighting for. I think whatever fight we pick, Dave hit the nail on the head earlier when he said that whatever we do should be underpinned by compassion. So I think people will pick their own battles, their own fights, and they'll decide what's most important for them to become actively involved in. But if your action is underpinned by compassion, then I think you're heading in the right direction. So many of the populist issues that are becoming dominant at the moment are driven by the opposite of that. So I wouldn't dare to say to people what they should fight for, but fight for it with compassion as your guiding principle would be my suggestion.
Yeah, well, I can't say any more eloquently, you know, in the same way that I couldn't have talked about Orgreave and the miners' strike more eloquently than Martyn does in his chapter. But I do think it comes down to that. I think in the final analysis, you know, if you strip away the politics speak and just have a conversation about sort of, you know, kindness and sympathy and pulling together, and you know, we've seen this in these COVID times where, you know, the people who in the most, you know, been vilified most recently, who've been ill-treated in terms of pay, in terms of you know, sort of so-called abrogation of responsibility and what have you, are the people on whom we've depended so greatly, you know. And I think that the twist of the knife in terms of our opportunities here are to continue to reinforce that and say, look, you know, doesn't this just show how coronavirus is impacting on particular groups in society? Why is that? And why is it that the people we're turning most to for help are the ones who in the recent past have been greatly vilified? I think that if we can take advantage of that at this moment, then, you know, the game's a good one.
And this, if I can make a belated attempt to add something to an earlier answer when you asked about the role of literature. This is where literature and the arts come in, I think, is because what literature does above anything else is its subject is the human condition, but it trains writers and readers to engage with people who aren't them, to step into someone else's shoes and to imagine their life and what that life must be like. And I think that's the role that literature can play in encouraging that philosophy in us as people as well as readers.
Thank you so much for those answers. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope you will join us again tomorrow night. And thank you again to both of you for a wonderful piece of literature and a great follow-up. I think the pairing of this format does so much to enlighten and inspire.
Thank you, Karen. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.